Okay guys, in this video I'm going to demonstrate to you how you exchange the controllers on our bikes. To do that, as you can imagine, I'm going to need to remove a lot of the plastics to gain access to that. So I'll crack on with that now, and then we'll catch up again in a minute. Several of these connections on the controller, you are going to need a very small pick just to lever up ever so slightly gently on the locking catch that's there. If you use a screwdriver, you're more likely going to snap the tab that's on there. So I'd suggest getting a small little pick, just ever so slightly lever up the locking pin, and you can then just pull the connections out. Again, for the encoder connections to the controller, same again applies. Just use the pick rather than going to the default as a screwdriver, as most of us tend to do, because they are quite fragile. But if you use a pick, then you can get away with being a bit more aggressive with it without causing any damage. Okay, so the three cables that go from the controller to the actual motor itself, they are push fit connectors. However, they've got small tabs on the sides of the connections. Again, you just need to be a bit careful of what you're doing here, because if you pull the tab too much, then they could snap off or bend back. If they bend back, then they won't have that locking mechanism when you go to reconnect it. So the way I tend to do it is, if you just pull one tab away and apply a bit of pressure on the cable, it tends to hold that pin in place. And then if you come the other side, pull the other tab, the cable then just comes apart. So I'll repeat that on the other two cables. So now I've disconnected all the connections into the controller. The only thing that's left to do is just remove the two fixing bolts that hold the controller in place. What you'll find is when you remove both of these cables, that the wiring harness and the brake line run on top of the controller in these little fixing tabs. So once you remove those bolts, the controller shouldn't move too much, because those cables should hold it into place. You then just have to be very careful when removing these cables from those tabs that you don't damage them in the process. So I'll just remove those two bolts now. So as you can see, the controller is now free, and it's just the harness, wiring harness itself, and the brake line that is still attached to the controller. So I'm just going to very gently remove those out of the tabs. And there we go, the controller is now removed from the bike. So we'll just repeat the process now, or backwards I guess, to reinstall the controller back onto the bike. Slightly different procedure when you go to offer the controller up. Rather than installing the wiring harness and then the brake line before I fix the mounting points, I'm going to do it ever slightly different. It's just a bit easier if you mount the controller first, but don't tighten the bolts completely up so the controller is still able to move about on its fixing points. This just gives you the flexibility then to be able to put those cables back in there without the controller floating around. So I'll just do that now. So I've just secured the controller. Just before I'm going to hook up the wiring harness into the controller fixing tabs, it might be worth you noting that these two spade connectors down here need to be connected onto the relay. So I'm just going to do that first before I fix this cable, because if, for instance, if I hold this cable up here, they're actually too loose, they're too short, and they won't go on those connections. So with that still loose, I'm just going to make sure that both of these connections are reinstalled first before I then fix the cable into place. Just to mention that one of the cables for the controller fixes on top of the relay. That's a just for reference, it's a 13mm spanner that you'll need to remove that nut. So now I'm just making sure that each one of these push fit connectors is all the way home. You should hear a little click from each connector just to let you know that it's where it should be. So it's just worth noting that when you're reinstalling everything. Okay, so now the controller's all reinstalled, all the connections have been reconnected. At this time, it's probably worth, before you put all the bike back together, put the battery in, turn the bike on and make sure it functions as it should do. Just in case you've missed something and then you've got to take all the plastics off again. So we'll do that now. It's also worth checking that by default when you reinstall the controller, it puts all the 3 settings, the power, speed and response, down to 0, or the lowest setting. So it's worth just changing those settings just to make sure that you see a noticeable difference from the standard, just to make sure that the controller is working correctly. So I'll just demonstrate that now. So that's great. As you saw, there was a huge difference between standard and me changing those settings. So we know that everything seems to be working as it should. So I'll now continue to, I'll turn it off, take the battery out, put all the bike back together, and then we're good to go. Just another little tip, guys, when you're tightening up the seat bolts, if you just apply a small bit of pressure onto the back of the seat, it just makes it easier for you to get the bolts lined up for the holes. And it's worth just holding that pressure down just until you finish tightening up the bolts and then release and you're good to go. That's it. Okay, just to take note, guys, that when you're reinstalling the controller cover, just make sure around the sides here where you've got several cables, you've got the encoder cable here, just make sure everything's all pushed out the way before you push the cover back into its place. It's very easy to get some wires caught up there, so just make sure that you push everything out the way when you reinstall the bolt. When fixing the bolts back up for the cover, it's worth putting both the side bolts in first. But just enough to hold the cover. You don't want to tighten it up just yet, because you need to tighten up this tower bolt here. And if they were done up tight in that position, obviously you're going to put stress on the plastic when you hold that back into place. So it's worth just having these 2 bolts ever so slightly loose. And then we'll then do the tower bolt now, which I'll show you. So the OSET toolkit, you get a ball-ended Allen key. Now to put the bolt up into the tower cover here, using a ball-ended Allen key is quite difficult because the bolt tends to move around quite a bit. So it's worth getting yourself a straight full-mode Allen key for this purpose, just so it holds the bolt perfectly up straight, because you can't actually see the hole that you're putting the bolt into. So just having a straight Allen key just helps you align that into place. Okay, so that's it, guys. Controller is now reinstalled, all the covers, the seat and the plastics are all back on, and we've tested it prior to doing that to make sure the bike works. So we can now put the battery back in and you're good to ride, everything's all good to go.